What's going on, y'all? KMBest here. The new Marvel Snap meta is in full force. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Let's start with everyone's favorite KM Brew. This is Butt Slot 2 Electric Buttaloo. And the way this deck looks to win the game is by abusing ongoing abilities alongside the newfound power of Ultron. Now, this is, I think, the most complete build of Ultron Patriot because of the inclusion of Pixie and Mobius. Now, I know people are going to ask, hey, KM, can I cut Pixie and Mobius? You can. You end up cutting Pixie and Mobius, replacing them with like Wave and Invisible Woman, and that ends up being mostly fine. When you do something like that, you're also going to want to cut Squirrel Girl for a Mystique. You can make those swaps. I just tend to think that this deck has more game into the rest of what you're going to see. The reason for that is because Mobius is not just a card that advances your game plan, it is a good tech card, and Pixie is not just a combo card, it's part of what keeps your power output hidden. Keeping your power output hidden means you can win a lot more cubes. Now, Invisible Woman can have this effect, don't get me wrong. But at this point, everyone kind of gets it when you play an Invisible Woman and then a card in it on 3, and then a card in it on 5, and then a card in it on 6. They know what's going on. They know that's Invisible Woman, Patriot, Blue Marvel, Ultron. And if they know that, they can try to play around it. That's a bad spot to be in. So I contend that the Pixie Mobius build of Patriot Ultron is the best version of the deck going forward. I think this is the right way to take the deck. There are some customizations you can feel like you need to make in various metagames. If you're seeing a million mirrors, Super Scroll is a fine thing to put into the deck. However, generally speaking, this feels like the safest list to just play into an open metagame. It is good, it is powerful, a lot of points, a lot of built-in surprise. People are, at this point, in my experience, mostly playing around Ultron, but sometimes they don't even do that. Next up, the reason that I feel compelled to run Pixie Mobius beyond just cube equity, it's Loki. And Loki is just as good as you remember it being. This is a list that is running cards that may not actually be necessary, very expensive cards in it. It's obviously the one that I had the most success with, but I'm not entirely sure if I can chalk that up to the cards like Nocturne or Red Guardian, or if Loki's just very good right now. I personally think that Loki is just very good right now. This is a good deck into anyone who is not doing Pixie Mobius in their ongoing deck. It's a good deck into the Darkhawk Clog Decks. This deck has a lot of good matchups in the metagame right now, and I don't think those matchups are particularly defined by cards like Nocturne and Red Guardian, although I will say Red Guardian, in my opinion, has become a little bit more important in this list because of the power of just turning off a Patriot, right? A lot of the decks that are not playing things like Pixie Mobius are going to be playing just, I'm playing a Patriot on turn 3, right? You get to turn that off. That's a very good thing for you. In addition, sometimes you can also turn off that Mobius. That is also a thing that happens. So Red Guardian, important for this deck to deal with some of the major things that are happening right now. Generally a good card to have. I would say more important than Nocturne in this deck. Now, as for Nocturne, I know people are going to ask, hey, KM, should I buy Nocturne? I think she is likely going to be one of the best cards you purchase this season. So if you had to pick one or two, Nocturne is probably going to be a good use of your tokens or your spotlight caches. I will say the cards alongside her, not very good at all. Selene, not good at all. Not worth investing in. So there is some consideration for looking at the full contents of other spotlight caches. However, I do think this build of Loki does benefit pretty strongly from Nocturne, just having a good body, moving around the board. That's the kind of stuff Loki is already doing, being able to commit to 2 lanes hard or spread across 3, additional location control. She's a good card in here. I would not think that she is anywhere near required to play the deck. There are about 4 different Clog lists that we're going to have to talk about here. We're going to start with just the basic no frills Clog list. I played this to some success in High Infinite. It was not a deck that I hated. In fact, it's a deck that makes a lot of sense right now. The major thing this deck is defined as is a Darkhawk deck. You really want to play Magic, you really want to play Darkhawk, and then you have both US Agent and Shang-Chi and Super Skrull, all to clean up the things that you get onto the board with Darkhawk. So against a deck with Iron Man, your Super Skrull is going to be amazing. Your US Agent's going to be amazing. You have a ton of value that you're getting out of this stuff. I'm losing the lane. Oh, I need to play 2 Shang-Chis. You effectively can play 2 Shang-Chis because of just how good US Agent is. Like, US Agent in this deck is your second Shang-Chi. Your play pattern is very often Doc on 5, US Agent Shang-Chi on 6. That's how you want to win these games. And I think that is sort of the defining characteristic of a lot of these Darkhawk decks, is it's very much Doc and pray. It's very much, let's just play this card, see how it goes, and clean up, deal with it later. Now, part of the reason this is good is, there's a lot of people playing Ultron right now, and that's a really good thing to do. This is also just sort of a good cannonball deck. Like, there's a bunch of good cards in here that are not entirely Darkhawk reliant. One of the things that this deck really does struggle with, though, is it felt to me very Magic reliant. Magic staying on was very important. And I think that's part of why I ended up liking the Nocturne in the Loki build, because you have a way to turn off the magic that these decks are playing. And I think it's probably like 15% of my meta was this kind of stuff. Not exactly this list, but this kind of stuff. And that is a way to turn it off that you can just put on the board and then Loki, and you don't have to worry about oh, do I need my Snow Guard here? Do I want to Loki my Snow Guard? You just got it, right? And so I think this deck tends to struggle with those situations. But again, just Shang-Chi US Agent is an incredible power swing that can absolutely catch people off guard. In addition, Darkhawk Ang and Ultron is obviously absurd. So here's where things get a little bit weirder, right? Like, we are in a situation where there's a new card that came out, so people are playing Blink in this kind of shell. And I think, again, I'm not sure if this is better or worse than the previous version. I had more success with the previous version, but I know people are going to be looking for decks with Blink for the mission. And I think this is an interesting thing to do, right? One of the things that really struck me when I tried a Cannonball Blink deck was, I'm pulling the cards I don't want. I don't want to be pulling Cannonball before turn 6. I want to be playing that on turn 6. I want that to be at the final turn of the game, right? And so I tried some Professor X stuff. Again, same issue. But this deck, I think you're more okay with pulling a Darkhawk, right? You are actually way more okay with pulling a Darkhawk than you are a Professor X if you are a Blink deck, because you can clean that stuff up. Again, US Agent ends up being really important because you end up having to cut Shang-Chi because you're a Jubilee Blink deck, right? So US Agent as your quicker picker-upper for all the crap you put on the board with a Darkhawk is gonna end up mattering a lot, which necessitates the use of Luke Cage. So yeah, that's how this deck ends up being like this. Of course, it is using the powerful combination of Leech and Blink as well. There's kind of just a lot of disruption in this deck. And really, if you are trying to play cards in a specific order, you're going to run into some trouble when you run into a deck like this. Now, the opposite thought process applies to this Clog list, which is saying, hey, look, I don't need any of those newfangled Blink Leeches to win my games. I'm going to win my games the old-fashioned way with Debris, with White Widow, with Titania. I'm just going to full clog them, and that is going to be it. It's going to be over with now that I have full clogged them. And I think that is a very admirable thing to do. This was the list that actually gave me the most trouble across the board. This is a really scary list to play against because not a lot of people are playing Annihilus, right? One of the major things that the Leech resurgence has really brought into this metagame is that it's very hard to play Annihilus. And so all of these early Clog decks, these Clog decks that are focusing on getting these lanes clogged by turn 4, and then not worrying about if they get Annihilus back because that's just not a thing, that is a successful strategy right now. And that means this is a successful strategy right now. It's a reasonable strategy into the Ultron decks, into Hela decks, into Loki decks, because if you're not an Annihilus deck, guess what? You're not running the counters to your own strategy anymore. Loki ends up really actually struggling with this, which is a very good thing to do. To absolutely nobody's surprise, Hela is still a deck, although I do think at this point I would not really recommend it, but it is the kind of thing that is a legitimate threat that you need to deal with. But here's sort of what's happened to Hela in the past week. First, Leech showed up, and that's obviously not a very good thing for your on-reveal game win card. That is absolutely a problem, right? The second thing that happened to Hela is, as a reaction to Leech showing up, we just saw that the Clog Decks started getting smaller a little bit. They're doing weirder stuff. You're suddenly in a situation where, like, oh, they Darkhawk you and then Shang-Chi you, and you actually die to that. They full clog a lane, you die to that. They're still probably playing Professor X some of the time, you can die to that. In addition, again, there's these Ultron decks now, and unless you're discarding the Infinite specifically, most of the guys you discard are not big enough to compete with a good Ultron lane, right? Like, if they're just doing baseline, Patriot, Blue Marvel, Ultron, that's it. That's 20 power in every lane. That's 20 power in every lane. You actually have to consider what your odds are of beating that. And if you're not discarding the Infinite, you can really end up in some trouble in those matchups. So Hela has ended up in a spot where it is a powerful and reasonable and okay deck, but like things keep happening. And those things have always, at least over the last week, made this deck a less reliable winner. We all know I'm a bit of a fan of the Noki list, the Loki-less Loki. However, I will say I think it's a little bit worse positioned than it previously was. While I do consider it relatively good into the Clog stuff, partially by virtue of Luke Cage being in the deck, it struggles with the small Clog to some degree. And in addition, it ends up not having enough points to really compete with the big boy Ultron decks. You end up in an awkward spot there. It's almost to the point where I would consider playing Killmonger in there just because of how horrible that matchup is. But the fact that there's some decks in the metagame that just like go really big still, you have a lot of problems with Hela, you have a lot of problems with Ultron, and those decks are just kind of awkward for you to beat. You end up just sort of locking yourself into almost always losing to them. In exchange, you have this incredibly dynamic and interesting and intricate small hate bears type deck that I really like playing, but I do think right now I value the haymaker that is Loki over anything this deck is doing. It's funny, Darkhawk got nerfed, and there are more Darkhawk decks on my tier list than there ever have been. I'm starting to wonder if maybe they were onto something with that Darkhawk nerf, because here we have the sort of baseline good cards Leech Blink Shell that Darkhawk is sort of enabling or just existing in concert with, because you like having an ongoing card as a reasonable threat that is not going to die to opposing leeches. You like being able to blink into big stuff that really matters. Blink Leech is a very powerful thing to be doing. There is some inherent tension in this deck, though. Like, one of the things you may run into is you end up in situations where, like, oh, I have this 6-drop in my hand, and without Hope Summers, I'm really not going to be able to play that alongside all my, like, kitty stuff. The way it tries to fuse the kitty stuff with the blink stuff means you're running a lot of 6-drops, and it tends to mean that your final turns of the game involve playing a 6-drop. So if you don't have Hope Summers, you're not going to be able to efficiently fuse that with your Angela game plan. What that means is this deck power spikes with Hope Summers more than most other decks even could dream of, because Hope Summers is what enables you to fuse the Angela and the 6-drop game plans here. That is the real thing that she's doing. She is the fusion point of this deck. And so that is an important thing to grasp when you play it, because when you have your Hope Summers, your deck really comes together. It almost reminds me in terms of play patterns, similar to like the Shuri Kitty deck, where it's like when you have this and you're like Hope Summersing into, like, in the Shuri Kitty deck, it was like Hope Summers, Shuri Red Hulk, right? But here it's like much the same. Like, you're Hope Summersing in order to make your Angela play pattern good and also play a big 6-drop. She's a really important card in this deck, and you should consider snapping her just because of how awkward the deck is when you don't have those draws. Phoenix Force is fine, but it's actually taken a bit of splash damage from the change in the meta as well, right? Like, this is not the deck that's like absolutely losing to Leech, but there are situations like when you're a Nimrod deck, you end up in situations where you really do need your on reveals on turn 6 of the game, and you just don't have them anymore. In a similar vein, like the Hela deck, it has also taken a bit of splash damage from just how tall the Ultron decks can get. One of the things that I've noticed playing the Ultron decks into both Hela and Phoenix Force is you know they don't have any interaction for you, so you just get to go for the largest possible number you can create and see if they can actually match it. The thing about the Ultron decks is they have combo-esque numbers, right? And so when you go up against an actual combo deck, you get to just like fairly reliably play your curve of cards that outputs that amount. They have to jump through a lot of hoops like Phoenix Force does. And so I think Phoenix Force, just like Hela, is taking a little bit of splash damage from just how wide the Ultron decks can get. There's no free lane wins against those decks. And I think also from the existence of Leech, although I think to a lesser degree than Hela. On to the honorable mentions, starting with Destroy. As always, it is the first week of a new metagame. And when it's the first week of a new metagame, Destroy is a really good thing to do. It's just a safe, classic points play. Again, you run into some issues. However, as a Leech deck, like, they're not leeching your null, they're not leeching your death, you're just worried about the points they can put out, right? Like, that's actually the worry here. The issue this deck has, if anything, is the combination of, like, Professor X existing, which is obviously pretty bad for a deck that's bouncing a Deadpool back to hand a lot of the time, and the fact that the average points in a game, it feels like, have almost never been higher. And we talked about this in relation to Phoenix Force. We talked about this in relation to Hela. And it's like, this is a deck that has a similar, not a similar matchup spread, but it can play like a combo deck. And so it runs into these problems where what were previously really good matchups end up being not really good matchups. Now, one of the things that it ends up having an advantage over in terms of the Ultron stuff, your Killmonger deck. Like, you actually can make that happen. It's not, again, it's not like the most incredible thing you can do, but you can throw priority and play like Killmonger Death Deadpool on the final turn of the game if you get that death cheap enough. Like, you can do that. It is a thing that you are allowed to do, and you should, against those Ultron decks, see if you can pull off that throw priority into Killmonger. If you are interested in playing Bounce, I think Hawk Bounce is still a perfectly functional deck. You do run into some leech risks when you are centurying, right? Like, you do run into that. It is a thing you have to worry about. But what this deck does manage to do is just generally play a safe, controlled, and powerful game plan against what your opponent is doing. You get to restrict their locations, you get to restrict their draws, you get to put a bunch of rocks in their deck, you benefit from that with big guys. You can just play a normal game of Marvel Snap. Now, I'm going to draw a distinction here between this list and the Blink Hawk list, because I do think it's not necessarily set in stone yet which of the lists ends up better. I also think that, like, there's a pretty coherent argument that you could just go back to the old version of the Blink Hawk list, not play Blink Leech, see how that does for you. Although Blink Leech was the swap for Annihilus and Sentry, so you can sort of see how those lists end up being in the same space. One thing I would be interested in, at least a little bit, is trying out an Angela package in here, the early game from the other list, and seeing if that ends up making more sense than the Bounce early game. You're putting a lot of pressure on this deck in terms of the Bounce cards to generate points, and while I think it is overall a more cohesive list, it makes a lot more sense in its own context than the one that is reliant on Hope Summers to, like, actually let you do your thing. I do think that there's something to be said for trying out other early games in this shell and just sort of seeing what works. Ongoing's a deck still. Yeah, crazy, right? People still play this. It's okay. Like, I think it, unless you tech in a Mobius, it really struggles against Loki. It tends to struggle against the Patriot decks as well. It's very reliant on, like, Jean Grey, Cosmo, and then they, like, Wasp you, or they have played a Pixie, and so you sort of end up in an awkward spot there. It's not awful. This is not an awful deck. It is honestly perfectly fine, and it's a very solid budget option as well, so I don't want to trash it too much. But I do think that of all the decks on here, when I looked at the stats for them, this was the deck that actually had the worst stats. So I do want you to take that with a grain of salt. Token Anni is a plausible deck. It's not my favorite deck in the world. When you think about when this deck was made, it was built to combat an Annihilus metagame. This was the anti-Annihilus Annihilus deck. And now that the metagame has sort of moved in a completely different direction, now that Annihilus is suffering under the heel of Leech, it's not as valuable to position yourself as the anti-Annihilus Annihilus deck. You're still doing some strong stuff, don't get me wrong, but the specific positioning that made this deck make a lot of sense is no longer there. And I think that is a thing to consider when you're looking for decks to play is, does this deck still make sense in the new context? Finally, I can't believe I'm putting this on here, but I lost to Cerebro 3. There's someone in the top 10 playing Cerebro 3. Cerebro 3 is an honorable mention. Yeah, absolutely. Now, there are some really cool things that this deck gets to do right now, right? You have a bunch of strong, powerful cards that are reasonably good at doing what they do. US Agent especially is just a really good addition to what this deck is already trying to do. But doing things like throwing priority into playing Valkyrie, pretty strong right now, a good thing to be doing. And you can like fight on points. You can really combat other decks on points when you have this stuff in your back pocket to like actually just win lanes, right? Like, it's not amazing, but when you are able to pull off stuff like Cerebro Mystique, you are almost always going to figure out something stupid to do with that. And when you have that kind of stuff, when you have that kind of baseline power, your special abilities in this deck can really take you home. Cerebro 3, cool, legitimately cool. You've got Quake scams, you've got Valkyrie scams, you've got US Agent scams everywhere, backed up by some actual power. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through that video. I got kicked out of my house by a storm, and so I am currently in an undisclosed location. That's why everything's all weird. That's why my camera's all weird. That's why the lighting is all weird. I am broadcasting from an undisclosed location, so of course, thank you for sitting through that. I do apologize for the technical issues, but I figured it was more important to get this stuff out there so you could actually be equipped to deal with this metagame, because it is a very interesting metagame. To me, it feels a little bit contracted. This metagame was very wide open, but the addition of Leech and stuff to it has brought these Doc decks out, has brought Loki into the mix again. It feels like the metagame is shrinking again. And I'm not sure I really like it, to be 100% honest with you, but there is so much to explore still that I'm not as upset about it as you might think. That said, it does sort of feel like the vein of possibilities is getting smaller and smaller right now. And I do think Leech Blink has a lot to do with that. I am a huge fan of beating the crap out of Hela, but I do wonder if maybe a better solution would just be like change the card Hela and not do the Leech thing. I don't really know. I'm not 100% sure. That said, as always, I've been KMBest. I really appreciate you making it this far in the video. As always, I said that twice. I've been streaming for 10 hours. You're just going to have to bear with me. Thank you so much. Enjoy the KM Boost, and I will see you in the next one.